Folks, grab a cup of coffee and let's move to the table if you aren't there already. Okay, I think we have everybody. We have some attrition, but some folks have schedules they're trying to deal with. Thanks, everybody. So far, it's been a very productive meeting, but I think there's some things we need to talk about to improve it in the future moving forward. But first of all, let me thank the staff for what they've been doing as far as supporting us, and the dinner last night was terrific, and just thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause. Even though we're operating under the FACA guidelines, this morning is basically our time to have a discussion about a couple of things, and I'd like to focus on two things. One is content of what we're doing, and the other one is process or how we do it. And I think we can make some progress. We've done a great job organizing ourselves into subcommittees. My goal now is to optimize that structure in terms of the content of what we're addressing at these meetings, and then the process by which we do it. I want to take a really hard look, and I'll ask for your comments here in a little bit, about how many briefs we're doing, how long they're taking, the slides, the presentation, professionalism associated with that, and raise our standards, basically. We've got a lot to do. We don't get together that often. We've got to make the most out of the time that we have, and I've been approached by at least 4 or 5 people individually regarding how we might do that better. And my initial thought on that, and we can talk about it a little bit, is we have a subcommittee structure that's set up that has areas of responsibility and lines of effort, and while they overlap a little bit around the edges on some things, I'm of a mind, and I'll throw it out and we can talk about it. I'd like to see these briefs, except for the ones that we're doing that we're already working on, like Brad's briefs or something, in at least 96 hours ahead of time, so the subcommittees can review them. We can send them to the ones that are impacted. There could be some discussion. And then I would limit the presentation to a standard cover slide that we give them they have to fill out. That includes bottom line up front and that sort of thing, and then 10 slides. If you can't do it in 10 slides, then we're going to, well, we'll talk about whatever 10 slides you bring. And then backup slides are okay, and then ahead of time, get it out to subcommittees so you can actually chew on these things virtually. Because you're all, we can all do this via email before we get here. Those are some thoughts I had. I'm not locked into any of them. I'm really locked into improving content and process. So as as we move forward. So with that, let me see if JJ's got any administrative remarks and see if Brad's got anything to say. And Governor Geringer, if you have anything to say after that, we'd appreciate it too. JJ?
No, thank you, sir. We're obviously opened with your initial commentary, and I totally agree. There's always room for improvement. Yesterday, I think we had some wonderful briefings, but we probably had too many wonderful briefings, and so that's something that we've always struggled with. We do our best to ensure each subcommittee has an opportunity to put forth some of their experts, and I'm very interested to hear, along with my staff, on how we can improve this process, make it a little bit more streamlined and concise, and keep everyone interested, rather than have some of the briefings perhaps drag on a little bit. So anyway, sir, we will follow your lead, and thank you for the initial commentary.
Any admin remarks? Or Tom, is that it? Okay, Brad?
No. Thank you, sir.
Governor Geringer, any remarks? Jim, you may be on mute if you're on. I'll tell you what, we'll go ahead and proceed. Can somebody shoot him an email and ask him if he's okay there? Having basically thrown the grenade on the table here, what I'd like to do is go to the presentations of our international representatives while everybody thinks about all this, and then when they're done, we can have a conversation about it. So I'm not trying to elicit information from you ad hoc right away there. Okay? So unless anybody's got anything further, I recommend we go ahead and go to our representatives for what they'd like to present. And I have on the program here, and Sonia's remote, correct?
Yes, I can hear you. Good morning.
Yeah, we can hear you, Sonia. Would you like to go ahead?
Okay. It's not exactly a presentation, just some comments from my side.
We look forward to your comments.
I think that has reached a large, a huge number of users, and we know that not reach all places all over the world. We know that we don't have internet in all places, but it will be a big advance in terms of positioning. So this is what is missing to start operation in GDGPS, or even for real-time IGS, real-time corrections for everybody that can be used. So as GNSS user, high precision user, I see GPS interoperability with other satellite systems is strategic and important for its future. Again, we are focused in multi-constellation equipment here for high precision. And I see industry working very hard on that. So um, agriculture sector, for example. We have a type of collaboration, and private companies are doing a lot of investments here in Brazil. And of course, that everything associated with signal protection and for users' confidence, for example, receivers against jamming and spoofing interference. This is very, very, really very important for users. These are my comments at this moment. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you, Sonia. We've got a little bit of time for discussion. That's what I like, how we've got Lisa's part laid out this morning. Let me make a comment, and as you all know, I don't have a technical background, but I'm thinking in the future we might want to look at some thematic collection of things to talk about, maybe even drive the agenda at these meetings. But it seems to me this notion of high accuracy service, we've been involved lately with global DGPS, some of the presentations we've got about augmentation services, and as this relates to the euphemism gold standard and what it is we're trying to do. For me, it would be helpful to figure out a way to get our arms around this thing and have a way to establish a narrative and a way to talk about it and illuminate the particular issues that it can drive our agenda forward, but also to make valuable recommendations on how we need to be organized. As somebody that comes from the operations policy side, it looks to me like we've got a supply and a demand issue. What is it? Who wants to use it? What's the driving force? And then who produces it? Is it government or somebody else? Then there's issues related to how you value it and how you price it. I think within those general parameters, there may be some work for us to do. But since Sonia threw it on the table this morning, and I was thinking about talking about it later, anybody have any comments about how we might want to approach this thing, kind of in an aggregate framework? Any ideas or thoughts? If not, we can talk about it later. So I apparently have astounded everybody. Okay. Thank you, Sonia. Okay, Renato.
Thank you, Admiral. I'm here, and I would be very glad if our support can open the presentation I sent yesterday, in which I would like to extend the recent results of our research group to which I belong, the International Interdisciplinary Group. But while we are waiting for the presentation, I would like to extend also my thoughts on the way of working here, and I am sure that we all agree that our work, recommendations, and whatever we do is going to be invaluable input to many departments and also numerous organizations that will use them for their future work and also developments. And in that way, I'm strictly, as an engineer, I'm anchored in the statistics and the mathematics, and always try to express myself in a way that will provide measurable indicators and also the facts that can be objectively justified. So I would like to present my case as well in that manner. My presentation will address the sort of support and also enhancement of the proposal for the high accuracy and resilience service we discussed yesterday as well. And in that way, next slide if you please, my group have identified two major obstacles for GPS deployment and utilization. This means the understanding of the application requirements and also the means for mitigation of various natural but also artificial adversarial source of the PNT, thank you, PNT performance degradation. We did a lot on meanings and means for the mitigation those two obstacles. I have discussed in numerous subcommittees and proposed the importance of identification of GNSS application needs and requirements in order to align with the GPS performance we provide, because the means that GPS core system extends its performance is not completely understandable to the GNSS applications, and what the GPS core performance is expressed with does not always align and appear to be useful to the GNSS application. I also state the case of the European Union Agency for the Space Programs that made a survey and established a library of such requirements, and I propose the similar things to be done for the GPS, presumably during a gathering like the Iron GNSS Plus, where the voluntary survey may be the foundation for identification of such needs and requirements. Those can be combined, in our opinion, and yes, those may be combined in order to also move forward towards the advancement of the GPS, in order to more focus what a GPS operator can do in mitigation of the various effects outside its control, but also in the alignment of the GPS application requirements. Because the traditional way of the GNSS receiver as a box is now obsolete, thanks to many developments in the fields, especially developments in relation to the computer science and the access to the intermediate results of the I'm trying to get the next slide, but perhaps it is some obsolete in that way. Okay, sorry. There are numerous technology advancements recently, especially in computer science, but also in telecommunications, software-defined radio, statistical learning, machine learning brings the new novelty and new advancement that we can adopt and utilize in GPS deployment and development in order to get the cutting edge and the leading edge, and also to maintain the front sight in development of the satellite navigation. This modern perspective allows us, because we have been doing research on the application on the statistical learning in combating, in overcoming the ionospheric effects, that allows us a very new approach, the new concept in situation awareness of positioning environment we have found very important, at the same time revealing the GNSS operator from trying to get to mitigate the processes outside of its control, but allowing the GNSS receiver, now embedded in various equipment like smartphones, to monitor the immediate environment and do something itself in order to combat the natural but also the artificial causes of the GNSS PNT disruptions. Here are the results of mitigation of the ionospheric effect in the short-term and rapidly developing ionospheric storm, in which we show that this machine learning-based local developed GNSS correction model have beaten actually the standard Klobuchar model, making the case of doing it locally and in accordance with the understanding of local positioning environment. So this will also allow for the GNSS application to take a more productive approach, and with integration of the navigation part of the GNSS positioning process, while aligning this the requirement of the GNSS application with the bespoke GNSS corrections of the positioning environment. This means also that we can do the mitigation of the artificial processes and effects of the GNSS positioning using the adverse effects of the GNSS spoofing with utilization of the recent GNSS and also computer sciences methods and algorithms, and we will need developments and understanding of technologies that will embrace also the computer science, also the encryption, statistical machine learning, but also perhaps the introduction of the blockchain technology. In a summary of my brief presentation, herewith I call to understanding of the GNSS application, but also the assessment of the utilization of the latest communication and computer science technologies and algorithms. And with this, I would like to appreciate your attention and also discussion on that subject. With the invitation to the new event, new series of events we are planning to organize in Croatia, the so-called Baška Spatial Information Fusion meeting, that will also call for the specialists of the satellite navigation, machine learning, spatial sciences, but also computer sciences and the statisticians who will develop the understanding of the spatial data, spatial analysis, and predictive modeling, benefiting also the satellite navigation. Details will be available soon, but you can drop me an email on the email address presented here, and I would appreciate to get to be on service to you. Thank you so much.
Comments, questions? Okay, thank you, Renato. We appreciate that very much.
Thank you, sir.
Matt, looks like you're up next.
Okay, thanks, Kenyatta. So yeah, I've actually got a very brief presentation today. Probably the first thing to notice is I've changed my day job, which some of you know. I retired from Queensland Government earlier this month actually, officially, and I've taken up a position at the Australian Space Agency. The second point to make about that is we're currently in a federal election, and therefore we're in caretaker mode, so my ability to talk much about future developments as a new Australian Government employee, I need to watch that. So I'll just give an update on, very brief update on some things, but I'll avoid talking about future plans. So there's this I've been talking about at a number of board meetings over the years, the Positioning Australia program, where Geoscience Australia got a nice amount of money to build the Positioning Australia program in two parts: the positioning infrastructure capability, which is an increase in the density of our cores networks across the continent, as well as freeing up access to the data. And they've also been working on what they're calling the Analysis Centre software, which is a whole new suite of software which will be open source and will be the engine behind the online processing and ultimately the PPP processing for both the left-hand side of the diagram and the PPP that will be delivered via the GEO satellite once it's available. I know, for example, I think the precise orbit determination part of that software is now available as open source and is available for researchers, etc. And the whole access to data is all open data, and Geoscience Australia have been licensing data from even private sector cores, trying to free that data up for national and public good type approaches. So it's an interesting approach that I think is probably worth looking into in the context of the GDGPS discussion and the high accuracy discussions. So the right-hand side of the program diagram is the South Pan, as it's now called, for Australia and New Zealand's cooperation on an SBAS, which I've talked about previously as standard SBAS, current SBAS type system, as well as dual frequency, dual constellation, so next generation SBAS, and also a PPP delivered directly from satellite. And it's probably hard to see, but those little circles in the right corner of both diagrams says 3 centimetres. So the aim is for 3 centimetres coverage. across the entire continent. The procurement of the SBAS is progressing, and the GA website says initial capabilities expected later this year. So I didn't bother getting detailed information because we are in caretaker mode. So the second big thing that's happening in Australia in this space, pardon the pun, is the Australian Civil Space Strategy, and it has identified a few key pillars of what we should be doing in space in Australia, and also identified 7 priority areas, which are those 7 that are listed there. And the process for each of these is to develop a technical roadmap, which identifies some subtopics that Australia should concentrate on and or develop industry capability in, etc. So, for example, the communications, Earth observation, and I believe the robotics and automation have been published, and there's work going on some of the others, including the position, navigation and timing roadmap, which I'll be assisting on when I get back to Australia and do more than 3 days of work for the agency that I've done so far. So I can't really, again, I won't really go into details because of the caretaker type implications, but hopefully by the next meeting there will be good progress to report on both the PNT roadmap and Positioning Australia. And the final thing is I'll also put in a shameless plug for a conference. So I come here wearing the hat of IGNSS President, and we've decided to gather up our courage and try and hold an international conference in the first week of December, again in Sydney, as we have done in most recent years. The other thing I'll quickly mention, whilst I have the microphone and given Tad wants us to think about things, a couple of issues that are not this, is what's happened with that list of topics that went around US government and where we ended up with that. And the other one is, which we've been talking, a few of us this morning, on LEO PNT. So John Betts set up a session for the European Navigation Conference where Karen, Frank and I and others spoke, and Frank mentioned the I think it's Zona, is it? Zona, commercial LEO PNT proposals. And then there was also on the ION newsletter, and then it was referring to a more detailed article in Navigation Outlook by Deanne, who is here. And that was outlining the proposed Space Development Agency, so Defence Department Space Development Agencies move into LEO PNT. It's still early days, but it's a pretty amazing concept, the way it's documented. And as I mentioned to Tad before the meeting, given that we are space-based PNT and that is space-based PNT, we probably need to be thinking about that, or thinking about whether we need to think about it. But anyway, if there are any questions on the Australian side of it, I'm happy to take them. Thanks, Chair.
Questions? Matt sent me a 2021 article on the Space Development Agency PNT initiative. Is anybody here familiar with that? If not, I would ask Matt to send it out to everybody, and we can commence some conversation or some feedback around it, unless somebody has some comments to make here this morning. Okay, Matt, can we put it out to everybody, and we'll follow it from there? Thanks. In regards to your question, Matt, I should have said this at the outset of the meeting, that bad on me. I was the juggling priorities and trying to figure out what to talk about here. At the senior steering group meeting last week, losing track of time, there was some discussion of the list of items that the different agencies were interested in us pursuing. I had given some initial feedback about what was probably possible, what couldn't be done due to resource constraints, and what might be appropriately a role for us might be to support one of the agencies like DOT and what they were carrying out. The feedback we got from Stormy, and Stormy, you may want to comment, was they kind of rolled it up into 3 general areas rather than trying to come up with a detailed list. And we can get this out to everybody, but the 3 priorities they came up with were our views and advice on complementary PNT, BDA and augmentation, GPS civil signal monitoring. You could extend that into high accuracy service as well, I guess, and private sector views on PNT resiliency. Those are kind of, if you look at what our subcommittees are doing, those are 3 general areas where it all pretty much aligns with what we're doing. Between the senior steering group meeting and us convening here, I neglected to get that out to everybody. JD, I don't know if you sent it or not, but that's kind of where we stand right now. And Stormy, you want to comment on it? And we'll make sure everybody gets a copy of it.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. And of course, your work on, how does GPS compare to other systems, et cetera, that we've kind of used the gold standard nomenclature. There's a task in SPD 7 that says the XCOM has to produce an assessment every 4 years of GPS civil capabilities and compare that to, other GNSS, et cetera. So that work that you're already doing on that will be helpful as well. Thanks.
Yeah, the brief that Terry gave on the table that's being developed and what we're doing there, I think you need to look at that as creating the groundwork for what might be an actual written report we submit, indicating what the advisory board's view are. And again, not looking at it from what is an absolute gold standard, but Matt, you and I have talked about it. What are the 10 hard questions? How do we actually get our arms around this problem, and what do we need to consider? And maybe it's a multi-part presentation where we pose the problem, maybe in a different way than it's been posed before, and how we're going to attack it, and then a second part we might submit it. But I'd recommend that you folks in the subcommittee talk about that and tell us how you think about that moving forward. Okay. I see we've got Terry up on the screen there. You ready to go, Terry?
Yeah, as soon as I unmute, I will be. Yes. Okay. Hi, good morning, everybody. And sorry I can't be with you. Some of you may know it was my daughter's 30th birthday on Monday, and it was my birthday on Tuesday. So we had a few days of significant birthday celebrations, which prevented my travels. So I've got a number of points. I haven't got any slides, so I've just got a number of points I'd like to potentially discuss and raise. Some updates perhaps on, I guess, what people might be interested in knowing about what might be happening in terms of PNT in the United Kingdom. First of all, a comment on the discussion on the Geodesy crisis challenge that we had yesterday and the points that raised. And I very much support the discussion that took place afterwards about the need for positive and firm action to actually make something happen. Just give an example of what happened in the United Kingdom, because we were very much aware of the same problem a number of years ago. And so through Government Research Council funding, they sponsored a doctoral training centre, so a specific combination of 2 universities, the University of Nottingham, obviously my own university, and Newcastle University. And we were sponsored to actually run a PhD program with a minimum of 5 cohorts of students coming in, so a sort of 9-10 year program in the first instance, funded for a minimum of 10 to 15 PhD students every year. Now this is relatively small numbers, but if you add those numbers up straight away, you're talking between 60 and 100 new PhD graduates in geodesy and related geospatial sciences. And it's very positive action. It was addressing this deficit that was recognised, and so by specific investment from the government into a doctoral training centre to try and address that deficit that we talked about. So I think, I would hope that something similar can happen in the US. You have recognised the problem, we all recognise the problem, but it does need something. Now the numbers, even 100 PhD students, as I was talking about in the UK, is small numbers, but it's significant compared to you've already identified in the US. That would already be a significant improvement. So I would hope that something similar can be targeted in the United States. So if I move on now to the PNT in the United Kingdom, I'm sure many of you are aware that there's been a lot of studies over the last few years led by the UK government into the PNT, in combinations of experts, user groups, and really looking into the dependency on PNT and the resilience to that, as we're all aware of. And that's studied a whole range of broad use cases and applications to look at that dependency, the depth of that dependency, I guess the ignorance of that dependency, and then the criticality of that on our daily lives and services, and the degree that resilience might exist in the systems and in complementary systems for PNT. That all led through 2 or 3 years of work to the draft PNT strategy, which was submitted to Cabinet Office within Government about March last year. And I guess if I'd pick out 5 key points which might be of interest from that, and that's pertinent to some of the discussions perhaps we're going to have later today as well. The first is the development of the National Secure and Resilient Timing Reference. This is being based at the National Physical Laboratory, and that is seen as a fundamental, I guess, a building brick for future resiliency through PNT. That's actually in place and taking place now and is being developed. The second was the space-based PNT program, looking at a range of different constellation options, some innovative, some based GNSS approaches and constellations. That's still ongoing, that work, and is still one of the key priorities of the strategy. Also, something that's actually started already in terms of experimentation is a space-based augmentation service. So looking at the needs for SBAS in the future, for safety of life services, for obviously aircraft, but also moving it to maritime, autonomous vehicles, and higher precision versions of that as well, as we've been talking about here. Again, many of these factors, and I'm sure you're aware, are because of Brexit and the fact that the UK is no longer an active part of Galileo or the EGNOS program. And so there is that need for space-based augmentation services over in the United Kingdom. Also looking at how space-based position for PNT might be augmented by other terrestrial PNT services, and what mix of those and how we can build a sort of taking a jargon from another sector, the sort of plug-and-play architecture of how we can combine together different positioning systems to give that resiliency that's needed by the users. And already starting developments in the user equipment and application sector to exploit these different sources of signals. So at the moment, the Cabinet Office within government is leading a sort of multi-agency effort across government to pull those all together and to try and provide under one roof, under one focal point for cross-government integration of suppliers, of users, user engagement, collaboration with parties, interested parties. And all that is working towards this, again, I excuse the jargon, but this idea of system of systems, that no single system is going to provide and meet the needs for resilient PNT. So we have to build an architecture based on, a flexible architecture based on a system of systems approach to provide the robustness we actually need. As with any government activity, that is subject to the current spending review in the United Kingdom. And so I'm not authorised to make any announcements about any of these things moving forward as positive programmes. But we hopefully will see something a little bit more firm, I guess, over the next 12 months in terms of how this is actually going to be activated within government and what the outcomes will be. One thing of relevance as well, the part of the lead up to the PNT strategy that I mentioned a few moments ago, the draft PNT strategy, was working as subcommittees within that, similar to what we're doing at the moment within our board here. And it was mentioned by Jade yesterday that I was part of the skills education and training group of that. It's taken me quite a while, but I do now have full permission from the UK government to share the findings of that study with our own education, science and innovation group. So I will be sorting that out over the next few weeks with Jade as to how we can get maximum benefit from the study that we already carried out into, obviously it's UK focused, but there's a lot of generic suggestions and recommendations within there which I think will help our own work as we move forward with the ESI subcommittee. Carrying on, because of this interest or increased interest in PNT within the government of the United Kingdom, as the Royal Institute of Navigation, which again I'm sure many of you are aware, I'm the immediate past president of the Royal Institute of Navigation at the moment, and so we have now set up what we call the PNT advisory group to help government, to help industry provide an independent forum for discussion and information gathering and dissemination about PNT. Because although the government is trying to move things forward, as I've suggested, there is, as always, a need for communication with different user groups. So that's now been set up within the RIN, within the Royal Institute of Navigation, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that. I guess more general, but at a national level as well, the something called the National Space Partnership has recently been established as well. Again, as a collaboration between industry and government and other organisations to try and move the whole space agenda further forward within the United Kingdom and prioritise that. And part of their work at the moment is looking very much at the preparations towards the European Space Agency ministerial meeting, which will take place at the end of the year. This is the event every few years which really sets the funding scene for the European Space Agency from the contributing partners. And again, just to reiterate that although the UK left the European Union as a result of Brexit, we didn't leave the European Space Agency, and the UK is still a very active partner in the European Space Agency. So preparations for the ministerial at the end of the year are very important at the moment. And this is setting prioritisations in terms of where programs such as GNSS, PNT type programs are prioritised by the different countries around Europe. Personally, myself as well, I'm also involved with ESA through the Galileo, not Galileo, through the GNSS Science Advisory Committee, GSAC. And I've been a member of this for 12 years now, and this is very active in terms of looking at the scientific applications of GNSS, but also how improved knowledge of science can improve GNSS, again, like many of our studies here. A couple of projects there which might be of interest are the focus for the cislunar and lunar activities through programs joint with NASA, such as Moonlight, and a new proposed scientific mission to look at the scientific developments and applications of GNSS as a Genesis program. And that's strongly supported by the Galileo Science Advisory Committee and many others as well. So a proposed spacecraft called Genesis 1, which will combine together many of the geodetic sensors as active field BI transmitter, GNSS, active laser retroreflector, all on a single platform, along with other components as well. So that's a quick update. I mean, my final comment, I guess, before I shut up and give somebody else a go, is although I am set here remotely, Admiral, you did actually ask for comments on the workings of this board. It has actually been quite difficult to engage remotely. I know there's been problems with the sound and the visual relation in getting things transmitted online, but it's also been difficult for me to, and I'm sure others, to try and engage with the proceedings of the board as it's been going through yesterday, and hopefully it'll be better today. But it's been difficult to actually join in the conversation sometimes. I just made that general comment. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. And I appreciate your comment about the connectivity. What I've been trying to do is bring up the WebEx on my laptop so I have access to chat. And I did that yesterday, and then Terry tried to send me a signal, but I had to get off of it and go someplace else, so I never got his chat message. So I think one thing for the staff here, I think we're always going to have a situation where somebody's going to be remote. Given the world of work that we're living in right now and everybody's schedules, we probably need to think of a way to do that. I think the way to do that is for everybody to have access to just my initial impression is to have access to WebEx, so we actually have active chat that we can all use while we're having the meetings. But maybe if we could look at that moving forward and see what the art of the possible is. And thank you for bringing that up, Terry, and I'm sorry that I missed your chat the other day. I can't have the two screens up at once, and I just missed it. And you're right to bring it up, and I appreciate the recommendation. And if anybody's got any other slant on that, please feel free to offer it there. Okay, thank you, Terry. Dana, you're up next. Oh, yeah, Matt, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, Terry. It's Matt Higgins here. I was just going to ask that I only recently heard about that Genesis and that first satellite. Would you be able to send a link for some information about that? It's a quite interesting project.
Sorry, no, was that about Genesis?
Yeah, that first satellite that's flying VLBI and SLR and.
Okay, it's not flying yet, it's only a proposal, but I can certainly send you the material and I'll check with Lisa. There is a draft white paper which describes the mission in quite some detail.
Okay.
So I'll just check with Lisa if I have permission to disseminate that first of all, but I should be able to send that to you, certainly. Yes, we will.
It might be useful for the whole board even, or some of the other members. Yeah. Thanks, Terry.
Any other questions or comments for Terry? Okay, Dana.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, colleagues. Could you have the first slide, please? So, since last we met, in February, Russia invaded the Ukraine unconscionably and viciously, and reminded us all that we were in a world of great power competition with autocracies pitted against democracies and attempting to extend their reach over a larger portion of the world. And if we didn't remember it prior to our last meeting, Vladimir Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Kiselyov, reminded us that GPS and PNT generally are a part of that great power competition, a part of that struggle, and a key element when Mr. Kiselyov boasted, as Russian troops massed along the border of the Ukraine, that Russia could shoot down 32 GPS satellites and blind NATO. And of course, as we know from our speaker last time, this concerned the White House very much, and the White House recognized that GPS is, for the United States, still a single point of failure. Something of great concern in an absolute sense for the White House and all of us generally, but certainly also a concern in a relative sense, because our biggest adversaries, Russia and China, not only are they not as dependent upon space as we are, but they are certainly not as dependent upon PNT from space as we are, because they have terrestrial systems, and multiple terrestrial systems upon which they can rely if space is no longer available. So we are in a great global conflict, and GPS and PNT is a factor in that, and especially a factor for the United States, and especially a vulnerability for the United States. So those of you that have been involved with this for a while know that it would not be, okay? Next slide, please. This would not be, as a result of all this, Pat Diamond and I are bringing forward an issue that we discussed at our last meeting. No, one back, please. Yeah, previous slide. There's a lag. Okay. No, that's forward. Back, please. There you go. So much for the lag. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Here we go while we reboot. There we go. So for those of you that have been associated with this for a while, you would know that this would not be such a concern for the United States if, after establishing the national PNT architecture, as was done in 2008, the government had gone ahead and started to fill out that architecture with all of the various systems that it determined were needed to protect the nation. So reflecting this and urging the administration on, this advisory board has recommended several times that this architecture be filled in, as you can see. Most recently in 2008, sort of scaling down from recommending complementary PNT to recommending complementary timing. You can also see that timing was the subject of a 2018 Act of Congress requiring complementary timing, and 2021 recommendation from the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, which is a committee composed of CEOs and very senior executives of the telecommunications industry. And they told the administration, yes, you need to invest in a national timing architecture to protect all of our systems and the nation. Next slide. So why this focus down on timing? Well, one reason was that there wasn't universal agreement that the positioning and navigation was that much of an issue, which I, of course, I think we all take exception to. But as you have taught me over the years, timing is the foundation of everything. It is the one ring that rules them all in the vernacular. Next slide. But so why haven't we done something in the United States? Certainly with timing, which seems to be motherhood and apple pie. Well, there are those within in the senior career positions within high levels of the administration who have developed a series of progressive concerns and justifications, most of which that I consider spurious in terms of policy reasons why the federal government should not and will not take action. Next slide. So to address those concerns, Pat and I have developed a policy paper that doesn't talk at all about systems, other than to acknowledge that the Department of Transportation has opined that L-band signals from space, UHF and LF signals from the ground, and fiber to connect them all is an appropriate and perhaps the optimal way to safeguard the nation's PNT generally, and so certainly the nation's time. So our policy recommendation is to go ahead and implement a timing architecture that provides multiple diverse ways of timing, and to get that out to as many people as possible and have them use it. And that also includes making the service freely available pretty much the way GPS is. Next slide, if you would. And of course, the goals of executing this implementation would be, in the words of the Honorable Greg Winfrey, get the bullseye off of GPS. So just making it making satellites and signals much less attractive targets because they're no longer a single point of failure. If users have something to fall back on or switch to, why go to the trouble of interfering with GPS satellites or signals? Why not try and find a softer, more effective target? Also to protect against the unthinkable contingencies, massive solar and severe solar weather, accident, cyber attack, the low yet still greater than zero probability of a physical attack on GPS satellites. They add up to something that's much greater than zero, and we all know that the impact of that, so the risk to the nation is way more than we all want to accept. So protecting against catastrophe, and then finally supporting technology and competitiveness. Timing is the foundation of so many different things and we have seen so many new proposals for not only positioning navigation but other applications that rely on rock solid timing One example would be the Department of Energy's recognition that, yeah, GPS just isn't going to cut it for timing. We need to get it out there by fiber. A great first step, by the way, for a national timing architecture. We think that is a very positive action. We hope and encourage the Department of Energy to continue with that. But it provides the technology infrastructure that's needed for further development and to let all of America's strongest capabilities in innovation excel. So the final slide, please. So we suggest a non-technology but policy recommendation in terms of urging, once again, the administration to move forward with a national timing architecture. And the 17-page paper that expounds upon all those reasons why we think that the concerns expressed by some within the administration are manageable or not concerns at all, is a supplement to this. But this is where it all boils down to. So that is our suggestion, our proposal to you for your consideration. And thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions or discuss.
Brad?
I think this is an interesting push on your part to do something noble. I think that we need to delve into what we mean by those recommendations. And as you know, there's a few members of our advisory board that would like to discuss this further. Frankly, I think it would be worthwhile to have you to get together with some of those people. I think we know who we're talking about, and see if you can come to a meeting of the minds, and perhaps in a future working session we can duke it out. So are you reading the nuances, Dana?
So I haven't read John's email, but I heard about it, and I've noted his objections generally, or his concerns generally. And as I mentioned yesterday, after Tom talked about the PTA group's proposed efforts, I fully support them, but I see the efforts as complementary as opposed to in opposition. I would recommend that we discuss. There's really two pieces of this. One is the big idea: should the U.S. proceed and have a national timing architecture? If that answer is yes, then what should it look like? We think that DOT has done some great work to determine what that should look like. We think that this board also has a role to inform that going forward. But I think they're somewhat separate and complementary.
Understand what you're saying, no problem. But I still would suggest to you that you get into a dialogue and then perhaps in the near future or whenever bring to the board. If there are two diverse views on this, we'd like to hear clearly stated what they are. And if you had converged on a single view, then we'd like to hear that as well. Is that fair, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, since we've set the, let's hear Pat first. Go ahead, Pat.
Brad, I thank you for your suggestion. I agree 100%. There is no way we could implement a national timing architecture with a snap of a finger. This has got to be a phased, strategic approach. The beauty of it is all of the technology that needs to be available to do this exists. It needs to have the wherewithal, the implementation strategy, and the support to do it. But I absolutely encourage further conversation. That's a wonderful thing. Thank you for that.
I guess, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Dana and I corresponded privately before he put it out to the entire group, and I must say, initially very attracted to it. I'm now mindful of some interesting concerns that have been expressed by John and others. One concern that I thought was really kind of a primary concern is we're a PNT board, not just a T board. And I'm curious as to, Dana, why we would just focus on timing without focusing on positioning and navigation as well. What would it be telling the world about our priorities if only timing were the subject of a major initiative of this sort, focusing on a timing architecture without alternative or complementary positioning and navigation as well?
Thank you, Jeff. That's an excellent point. And as I replied to John at one point, I would fully support if the board wanted to recommend that the government move ahead with a comprehensive PNT architecture and implementing that. That's not a recommendation that we made last time. We talked just about timing, but I'm certainly supportive of that. Again, I think we need to get buy-in on the big idea as phase one, and then help folks flesh that out if and when they accept it. Right now, it seems as though the administration is not looking or open to a comprehensive all-of-government PNT architecture, but rather, or a timing architecture, but rather is content with a rather segmented approach that may or may not be coordinated and integrated on a government-wide basis. And let me add to what Pat said. Yeah, I'm perfectly, and to Brad, I'm perfectly willing to continue to talk about this. I think it bears further discussion. We brought it up last time. We brought it up this time. We're happy to talk about it in between and talk about it next time as well.
Penny's got her hand raised. Penny?
Thanks. I put my question in the chat. I was a little confused about the context of the proposal. Is this being proposed by Dana in the role as the representative of the RNT Foundation, or is it being proposed by the subcommittee on policy?
I'm sorry, on communication group. Is it being proposed by one of the subcommittees? Because I thought the sessions went out the
Right.
two national reps and the representative, specific non-SGD representative.
Right. This is something Pat and I have been working on for a while before the subcommittees. And we talked about it briefly last time, and we're happy to have it incorporated. However, the board would like. It is not a product of a subcommittee.
It's not a product of the subcommittee?
No, it's not.
Yeah, I would just echo Penny's remark. We've got the subcommittee framework established. I think that's the proper way to move this forward. And you could put it against a couple of them, but I think the PTA one is probably the best place to put it right now. And Dana, you're already Pat's on it. I don't know if you're on it or not, Dana. You're not, but
no, Pat's
we can cross over between these. Pat's on it, and John Betts is chairing that. He's not available here today, so I would be interested in the subcommittee's view, with the chairs weighing in and having that discussion and then coming back to the board. But is there I see Governor Geringer's picture up. Is there anything you want? Oh, your hand's up too. Go ahead, Governor.
Well, just following up on what Penny said, I think it's fine to emphasize the timing architecture. It also says a lot about the lead-in from that to governance, but we'll defer that for now. Dana, would it be possible for you to raise the context of the importance for the timing architecture, but then to supplement that or augment that, however we want to choose the word, to call attention to the other two parts of PNT, position and navigation. And if we can have a discussion later about Denver, I think that would be illustrative of the importance of all three. So would that be possible as you bring that recommendation forward for a policy approach? And I think you could use that to emphasize the need for more research and professional development, which is an example yesterday of the shortage of PNT professionals, particularly to so I think there's a broader context that you could frame this in and then highlight timing as the top priority. Would that work?
Thank you, Governor. I think that would work quite well. And in full disclosure, another reason why we focused on timing and the recent discussions have been on timing is because that is the only topic upon which we've been able to get any traction at all within government or within the administration. So, but yes, I think doing PNT with T as the perhaps first among equals, I think we can certainly recast it that way in a policy-like document. Yeah.
Just looking at the. Oh, go ahead.
What I thought the point that was being made was, understand your recommendation. It should be brought up following the new structure we have up through the committee structure in some way, and be vetted by the committees, in my opinion. This is not just Brad talking, but in such a way that we know we are coalescing on a vetted, agreed to position. It does not say don't do it. It doesn't say do it. But I think working, and PTA sounds like an appropriate committee, subcommittee. That's up to the chairman. Thank you.
Yeah, I noticed if you look at PTA and plus strategy, you cross those. Pat and Dana are on both of them, so I would. We can kind of set up whatever rules we want. I would recommend the two committees get together and discuss it and how we might want to move forward on it. I would say this, and this is more an artifact of, I guess, the world according to Alan, of how I've grown up in government and everything. I'm always looking for the grand framework that something fits into. That's rational, narrative, you can explain it in an elevator, you can talk to senior leaders about it. And it seems to me that our discussions over the last several meetings, especially with what's going on in the external environment, right now, a divisive government and everything else. I don't know if we've got the wherewithal or it's an overreach by us to come up with, PTA is fine, that's the first step, but is there an overarching framework that we can fit these pieces into that constitutes what the board sees as a strategic context about how we want to move forward on PNT, not just GPS. And the reason I raise that is moving forward on how we're going to, and there's been a lot of talk about what the committees are involved in. If you look at the traditional way of looking at how government operations are run, you got a strategic level, an operational level, and a tactical level. And I think there are activities to be carried out and follow-up items that can be pursued at all three of those levels. For example, I work obviously at the strategic level. During the transition of governments, I was working with the landing teams to make sure our charter endured, and we had the board reconstituted the membership, and JJ and I worked on that. So I think what we need to do is create, number one, that structure and what level we're going to operate at. Number two, where everybody's role in the board and the committees are on that, and then how we want to assign the taskings within that. And this is an area where it would fall into that. Now, exactly what that framework would be and how I would describe it, I think maybe we need to look at maybe reducing it down to some kind of a document, no more than 5 or 10 pages, that says this is how we view the world moving forward. And it's basically, now that PTA has established itself, it's in the architecture. I heard Fred Moorfield use it at the senior steering meeting the other day. Maybe we need to say, well, what does that really mean in terms of execution at this different levels of government and what it is we're trying to do to actually steer our work. Thank you.
If I might, one of the things that we talked about over the course of the days here that I think is a really important aspect of this is there's a sort of a central service associated with PNT that deserves the most exquisite level of protection that we can afford against all manner of spectrum encroachment, ASATs, whatever. All right. But increasingly, I think we're really getting, and this group probably has as good an insight as any body on the planet today. And that is, how do the communities of users and interest out there, what are their levels of dependency? And as we said, there's a good number of ideas here about how do we build sort of the mother of all matrices that somehow tries to capture what are the real dependencies, the critical measures, stuff that moves fast, stuff that's stationary. Because I think, particularly in this case, the timing, we're going to find out that there is no one solution to it. And what needs to happen is, and again, I'm a big believer in how can you help bring about more coordination, collaboration across all of government. But there may be some different ways to try to attack timing alternatives, if you will, that are more sector specific, that would obviously still connect to PNT and GPS and GNSS writ large, but it's not something where the program is going to solve all problems for all users.
Well, I think you're right, and the presentation we had by Oak Ridge yesterday kind of underscores that. Here's an exquisite application specifically aimed at the electrical generating community, by the way, that doesn't have P or N. Transmitting stations don't move. So they're able to isolate and really solve a problem to an exquisite degree. But if you take the best of all of those and you pull them together, as I would say in an overall architecture, I believe that's the way to go. Because any particular problem related to P, N, or T, Dana and a lot of us here, Brad, are simple sailors. The last thing I read in my standing orders before I went to sleep as a CEO of a ship is use all means of navigation to fix your position. So you should use all means available to fix what time it is or whatever it is we're talking about. And I think as long as that's the first principle, we're probably going to be all right moving forward. Greg?
Yes. First, I wanted to see if Renato had a comment. He was trying to get your attention earlier, so I don't want to step on his time. Renato? I was asking you were trying to get attention for a comment earlier, so. Okay. Okay. Well,
sorry if I missed him.
No worries. The point I was going to make is it's been beaten into me by folks who are expert in this that you can't know where you are until you know when you are, right? So I think we can broaden the definition to include positioning and navigation if the overall recommendation concerns timing. So that's kind of the top line observation. I say another top line observation is I think the function of the advisory board is just that, to provide top-line advice without getting into the minutia of the technologies or the architectures involved or the prioritization for the developments as they move out over time. So, unless we're asked additional information on that, I think it's fine if we say that this is the sense of the board. And then the third thing I would say, my principal concern is, as Dana said, to get the bullseye off of GPS, right? And I'll put it in an analogous context as to what's going on from a climate change perspective. We've got to get the bullseye off of petroleum sources so that we reduce greenhouse gas emission, right? So you're hearing about electrification, you're hearing about hydrogen fuel cell technologies. So what I'm saying is that's going to create a multifactorial future where there's no one dependence on any particular energy source. So we can use that thinking as to where we're trying to head from a PNT perspective by, yes, having GPS, but looking at timing, looking at other architectures that get that bullseye off of GPS. So I just want to put that in that context for further consideration. But
yeah, and because and you're absolutely right, and because of that, there's no one central agency or department that owns it. And so the genius, if you will, that we can bring to this discussion is to create a rebuttable presumption of what that architecture would look like that encompasses all those areas that we feel are important. And from a strategic level, I think that would be probably the highest level, because then that subsumes all the other stuff we're talking about. What does augmentation and high accuracy services relate to the gold standard? All that becomes part of that discussion moving forward. So I agree with you completely. And getting to a statement of the sense of the board or something like that, and I think we'll carry the discussion on. I'd like to come out of here with a couple of statements that we can say this is a sense of the board moving forward, where we have a consensus that we can just say this is going to guide our work, because that'll be the first doctrinal statements that'll lead us to the framework that I think we need, whether it's PNT 2.0, whatever you want to call it. Kind of my view. Matt, and then Jeff.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this idea that it's if you've got timing, you've got position and navigation. The problem, there's kind of a logical problem, I think, in the way you set that out, in my mind, is you said one ring, rules them all, but then you've actually taken a second ring and you've only made timing resilient. We're still relying on this timing back here in GPS. So you've now separated timing, you've made timing, but you haven't made N and P and N, and that to me,
Sorry, this PNN over here is still relying on the non-resilient timing. All you've solved is resilient timing. So there's, this idea that timing is the bottom of everything is true when they're together. If you don't make the timing in the PNT resilient, you've only solved timing. And that's what I've been saying for a number of meetings. It doesn't solve, yeah.
Jeff?
Yeah, as you heard in my remarks yesterday on behalf of the Strategy, Policy and Governance Subcommittee, we feel a big part of our problem is not knowing who our audience is for these recommendations. It's an awkward point to make, quite honestly, because it sounds like it's a personal criticism. It's not intended to be that at all. It could be an institutional criticism. But if we don't know to whom we are making a recommendation for a new architecture, whether it's T or PNT, we're not doing our job, I think. And it's important that we focus on that institutional dimension, because without that, I think we're shouting into the wind, and it's not going to make any difference at all. We're wasting our time.
No, you make a good point. I don't know we were talking at dinner last night, but somebody's got to deal with the folks that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but sooner or later, if we're going to make this thing effective, we got to get up to where the governance structure was set up, and that's the deputies of both DOT and DOD.
Put very simply, I think the system is failing the stalwarts who are working the issue today. They are not getting the traction that they need. They have the wherewithal to do it. They certainly have the expertise to do it. And I'm talking about people in all of the agencies that are involved in PNT. It's not a national priority. It's not at the priority level it should be. And that is a fundamental point which, if we don't continue to hammer on it, is going to be lost, and it will vitiate whatever other good recommendations we make, in my humble opinion, and in the opinion of the subcommittee. I want to emphasize that the subcommittee structure is extremely important. It has changed the entire character of this advisory board. It's incredibly important. It's important now that we rely on it and use it.
I agree. We got another comment over here, but I was thinking about this last night, Jeff, and I was thinking of two things that may be a better model for us to think about. One of them was rural electrification. We got to a point in this country where we realized everybody had to have access to electricity. And as a result of that, then you've got a whole lot of things sprung from the fact that now we've gone from consumer electronics up to everything that we deal with today. And the other one right now is access to Wi-Fi, to the internet. And if you look at the linkage between rural electrification, what we're trying to do with Wi-Fi and the enabling infrastructure this brings about, it becomes a much more viable argument against historical precedents for government taking a role in how you provision that utility to the public. That's kind of the way I was evolving in my mind. So I would support what you said. Karen, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just for the board's consideration, because I was involved in that national PNT architecture with Department of Defense back in the 2008 timeframe. And so I think, if you go back and look at the recommendations that are in the architecture, a lot of them are still valid today, and recognizing GPS is the cornerstone of that architecture. But I would recommend to the board, you may want to have a presentation from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So as the Executive Order 13905 was being initially implemented, one of the tasks in there was to develop a national research and development plan for PNT resilience. And so that was released, or I should say re-released by OSTP last August. An initial version was released in January of 2021. And that national architecture slide that Dana showed is actually in that R&D plan
And certainly for DOT, there's 14 recommendations in that R&D plan for PNT resilience, and the White House asked departments and agencies to self-select, so DOT signed up for 13 out of the 14, and that is very much informing our way forward and our efforts on PNT resilience, and just would recommend that maybe that would be good for the board to hear from OSTP at one of the future meetings, or perhaps one of the subcommittee groups. Thank you.
I hesitate to ask the question. Is there a single owner in government? Thank you.
Yeah, sir. Just this is Del Delpino for the folks on the net. Just a point on resiliency. So within the Department of Defense and the Space Force, it is the DoD's and the Space Force's responsibility to protect and defend our on-orbit assets to assure operation through conflict. And that's the basis of our 22 and 23 budget. There is a classified budget for space resiliency that has an architecture that addresses many of the threats that are out there. I think for this committee, so that's the responsibility of the DoD. And that's what we bring to the day-to-day mission, and that's what we're funded to do. But I think for the subcommittee that's looking at PTA to protect, toughen, and augment, to provide more assurance for complementary capabilities, I think that's a fair observation for this board. But I just caution us pursuing and studying overall space resiliency when there are many other parts of that architecture that the DoD is considering. Over.
I agree completely. I haven't spent 40 years in the military myself, but the issue is it's kind of like solving a equation, and you fix that part of it and you solve everything against it, and that's the provision of the signal. That includes a whole lot of assumptions about whether or not JPL should get in the business of selling enhanced services to people for a fee, because the original basis or the raw material they're using is insured by DOD, and that's not visible to everybody. And I don't even know where I'm going with this. I'm just saying it's so complex and convoluted that you can make an absolute statement about DOD's role. But then how are we to take that provision of that signal, which is a utility, if you will, and then make these other decisions about how to go to high accuracy services or where the rest of government should invest their money, and then create assured resiliency among the other things they do have control over. I agree with everything you're saying.
Yes, sir.
I don't know where that comes together if it doesn't come together at this board. So, go ahead.
The protect, toughen, and augmentation, to me, has to start with the DoD baseline that we provide. That's the service that's provided today. That is what's funded in the president's budget. That's your baseline capability. It's a baseline capability in the DoD budget for the things that the DoD needs to do with it. But this body encompasses, operations, requirements, day-to-day execution, business sectors that perhaps require additional protection, toughening, and augmentation for their own specific civil or international purposes. And perhaps that's where the energy needs to be for these studies. It says,
I don't think we want to replow ground that DOD's covered. I think you're right. I don't think anybody objects to that. The question is how are we to organize, prioritize it, how do we go about it, and who do we deal with? Because DOD is a singularity on the supply of the signal. When you get outside that, with the exception of maybe the larger stake that DOT has in any other agency, you can't find anybody to pin a rose on.
Got it. So I think that's a fair observation. But to me, the baseline gold standard always has to go to what's currently funded. Right? So there's a baseline budget for the DoD. There's a baseline budget for Department of Transportation. It's on the website. These are all the things that we're investing in to meet the President's and Congress's priorities. But there are other things for future consideration I think this board should consider. And I think that's all fair game. But I just want to make the point that where should we start as the baseline? And to me, it's what the DoD and the DOT have already programmed for.
Yeah, so what Cordell's saying is it
Well
all
said.
comes down to money, and I couldn't agree more. And yeah.
If I might just, I've said this before, probably not articulately enough, but I as I'm joining this, I really think the simplicity of the protect, toughen, and augment is a real plus. But to me, it's more than just simply a strategy or whatever. It is a fundamental organizing principle about how do you take a very complicated architecture, ecosystem, and bureaucratics, and maybe try to help everybody think through how do you actually apply that. Del reminds us here, and I think we're talking about, I was a little bit puzzled as we talked about protect, and certainly the scar tissue that you all have from the past 10 years of Legato, 99% of the energy that we were talking about here was how do you protect the spectrum, right? Well, that's a pretty important thing, obviously, but from the perspective of the agency and the department that's charged with delivering this capability, this service, this signal, they've got a universe of things that they're having to worry about out there. Cyber protection. They're having to worry about jamming, other things. How do you defend against ASAP? Oh, by the way, how do you make sure adversaries don't use our signals or that they use, like PNT signals, threaten our interests? So to me, the protect is a real sizable body of organization and capabilities that has to be thought through. It's about delivering the signal with high confidence and assuredness wherever it's needed, whenever it's needed. All the rest of the pieces, the toughening, there's a whole universe of communities of interest that, and we're already talking about and know lots of different things. So I guess I'm going to suggest here, going back again, the narrative is important. And to me, the PTA could be a real clarion call to how do we think about organizing activities and responsibilities and what it is that is expected across this very broad universe of players in this PNT world.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't have a military background, what you're just talking about is doctrine, basic principles and how you think about things, and maybe that is a better way to describe it. However, I would say that in the order of battle, on the DoD side, they're not worried about the ambulance in Denver going by Buckley Air Force Base.
So all the more, that's why I think that the whole idea, what are we talking about protecting? To me, the protection is about the assured delivery of the fundamental enabling signals to wherever and whomever it's needed. They then have a responsibility to ensure that they are then implementing it in ways that meets the needs of their application and responsibilities, whether that's be a commercial, civil, first responders, and the like. And that gets to all the things we're talking about toughening up. And so to me, as we think about however we're going to try to articulate this in the narrative, how this now maps to what are the organizational responsibilities, what are the central responsibilities in each one of these categories. I think it's PTA should be more than just a phrase. It's really, in my mind, a very, very powerful organizing principle and belief set.
Yeah, I think you're singing to the choir here. Was there another? Go ahead.
I've puzzled a lot about the question that is being raised as to who really is the central authority. And you keep poking at it and discover it's sort of no one. I would offer to you a thought, and Jeff, you may jump on me for this one. I think the only central authority that I see is the National Security Council. I think they're the body that if they were sensitive to some of these issues would be able to actually wade in and do something about it, because I can't see anyone else changing the course. And I don't know how you influence them directly or indirectly, but I'll throw that out as the only push button that I can see within our government that might conceivably actually have the power to do things.
Well, I would agree. It's a central body for facilitating the making of policy. But if we found out a lot of times in the last 10 years in this country, policy is not self-executing.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd go back to the Homeland Security Act to start with. But
I think they have power over the budget
yeah.
that exceeds any other single group that I know.
But when you move into execution, it's how do you actually make this happen? Hang on just a second. Russ, you've said a couple. Let Russ go first then.
Yeah, thank you. As I listen to this and having quickly looked at the article that Matt Higgins referenced, which outlines, I guess, if you read it, a DoD program going on LEOs, which very much match what my guess would be, understanding the technology and not being military and not being in any classified thing, lays out in that article a step process that to me would make sense, that handles many of these things we're talking about. And one of the questions I have for you or others, there are some of these things which they're being done, then we shouldn't bother to be talking about what's going on for protect our the alternate for PNT where things will happen in that kind of process, and concentrate our efforts on the things that need to be done that are not in that line, such as the education and other things, but that there should be some guidance that comes from magical security covered people that says, well, just don't spend time on this because we're already doing it in some way, and really concentrate this advisory committee on those things that aren't being done.
I think we kind of heard that. Dana? And then Jeff.
Yes, sir. So just to Brad's comment about the National Security Council, yes, but. So the National Security Council is an organization larger than most of us know, and so it has the attributes of most organizations in terms of default processes and the difficulty of getting things done in the absence of a champion. I'm sure that without yourself and the gentleman that you worked with on GPS, who was your champion, GPS would not have been developed through the normal Department of Defense processes. So the default processes at the National Security Council, and Scott can back me up or contradict me, but my experience with them is that if there is an issue that is a routine concern, they gather representatives from the various departments and collaborate and say, what is it that you're willing or able to do within your own existing resources and policy scopes in order to make this thing better. But there's not a whole lot of action. There's the Office of Management Budget has the ability to step in and essentially rule the roost and veto things. Unless and until there is a champion at the political level that can override and say, I want to get this done. I had numerous interactions with these kinds of interagency policy committees that essentially wrote documents that looked like action, but were really just holding exercises and crystallization of people's thoughts, with the one exception, and that's when the Maersk, Alabama was captured by pirates. And we had direction from the United States President that this will not happen again. And by golly, we were able to do things and change things to make sure that this never happened again. But things on like maritime security policy, Arctic, other kinds of things, there was no imperative, there was no senior champion. So in order to make things different than they are now, at least significantly, we need to find somebody at the political level that's senior enough and somehow get them to try to care about PNT and understand that this is a no-kidding essential capability for the United States, key to our competition with China, Russia, and potentially to our national position in the long term on the world stage.
Jeff, and then Storm.
Just forgive me, just a procedural comment, Mr. Chairman. we were so intrigued by the proposal from Dana and Pat that I think we inadvertently segued into the roundtable discussion.
Yeah, I was going to have the final presentation before we went to break after Stormy's comment.
And David,
so thanks for keeping us online there.
David's sitting here wondering if he's ever going to be able to talk at all.
And we thank Dana for the civics lesson as well. Stormy?
Just a point of clarity, in the same area where SPD 7 says, hey, the advisory board will advise the XCOM, it also tasks the XCOM to make recommendations to the president. And it does that through the NSC or the National Space Council, and it lists the appropriate offices in there. So there's a direct chain in there. If the advisory board says to the XCOM, hey, please make this recommendation to the president, there's an established mechanism to do that, and there's tasking in SPD 7 for the XCOM to make recommendations to the president. And I think that's where all those lines come together, except for lines that would go over to Congress, right? Because the president's budget doesn't get money unless Congress gives it money.
Thanks. I'm going to invoke cloture. At the risk of affiliating myself with the folks ethically challenged on the Hill, we're going to go to our final presentation.
All right.
David.
Thank you, sir. And good morning.
With that questionable introduction, go ahead.
And I do have a slide deck. We'll see if this remote works. Terrific. Well, I have just a few slides this morning, and hopefully can help get us back on track timing-wise. The two topics I wanted to discuss are the state of U.S. spectrum policy, as well as the activities at the FCC right now on receiver performance. So it is changing gears a little bit from the conversation before, but I think, as you'll see, it is very relevant to the work of this board, and I think we really need to take some deep thought and think about how this board can play a role. I will note, if you look in my slides as we go to the next one, I don't mention the words GPS or PNT in any of these slides. And I'd say to some degree that that's intentional, because both of these topics are bigger than just the GPS community. But if you ask anyone, both from the congressional perspective and those at the FCC, what are one of the prime reasons that's driving these conversations? It's the L-band and GPS. And so we need to have a seat at the table. The first slide, and I recognize, is perhaps an overly simplistic description of good versus bad spectrum policy. But the reality is good spectrum policy entails meaning that it works for all players in the market. My organization, in this role that I now have at the Consumer Technology Association, we have over 1,500 member companies. We have the traditional wireless carriers as members. We have the major automakers. We have consumer electronics manufacturers who are traditional makers of GPS receivers. We also have AT&T companies like the startup Higher Ground. So we have a diversity of perspectives, and the perspective that we take as an organization is to think about how all of the parties can work together to promote good spectrum policy. When we talk about bad spectrum policy, and when we talk about bad spectrum policy, what I would say is two things. When your family and friends are reaching out to you and saying they heard on CNN or MSNBC, what is that issue going on with the C-band and aviation? And I imagine many of you had family or friends who reached out to you. That's an indication things are not working. If we have good spectrum policy and the agencies are working together in coordination, from a consumer standpoint, it should be seamless. Your devices should work. We should be able to have 5G services that are the envy of the world. We also should ensure that GPS remains the gold standard for positioning, navigation, timing. Same in the automotive space. So we've got to do better. And I turn to the next slide, please. So I offer a few thoughts on what we should be thinking about. And I'd also point your attention, I had an op-ed in the publication Light Reading in late March that outlined some of these points. But obviously it does start with reform in the way that the NTIA and FCC coordinate with each other. As many of you know, in mid-February, NTIA and FCC, under their new leadership, announced a improved coordination process. And I think that that's a great start to outline a number of the ways that those two agencies can work together for the betterment of all stakeholders. There's, of course, the Memorandum of Understanding between the FCC and NTIA, which is 20 years old at this point, and I understand is in the process of being updated. We need to see that through to completion. And then the other point is that we need to ensure that the FCC and NTIA have the technical resources and expertise. As we've seen in a handful of spectrum bands, not just the L band, it's 5.9, it's C band, it's 24 gigahertz. I'm probably missing a few others, but certainly those have been the high-profile ones. We're seeing a common pattern here. We're seeing where an expert agency who has jurisdiction over whether it be transportation, weather forecasting, has had a perspective, and ultimately that hasn't been incorporated into the final decision on spectrum. And so I think having the expertise in those key agencies, ensuring that everyone is talking to each other, is going to be critical. Because the reality is, and again, I take the perspective of all stakeholders. I'm not here to point blame at any one party, but we have wireless carriers who are investing billions of dollars to unlock the benefits of 5G for consumers. And we also have 900 million GPS receivers here just in the U.S. So how can we ensure that all of those players are winners? Next slide. So I want to bring up a related topic because it definitely fits in with the conversation of spectrum management and how spectrum is used more efficiently. I know we've had some conversations about this proceeding. Maybe some of you are not taking a close look at it, but I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention because it is very relevant to the GPS community and the L band. But just some background. This is a notice of inquiry that the FCC approved at their April meeting. It was a 4-0 vote, and it really builds off many years of discussions around receiver performance, going back at least to 2003 when the FCC adopted a notice of inquiry that discussed incorporating receiver interference immunity performance specifications into spectrum bands. Then in 2011, there was a white paper on spectrum efficiency metrics. 2013, a white paper on interference limits policy. There was another white paper in 2015. So this topic, it keeps coming back and back. But I do think things are actually a little bit different this time, and for the reason that we need to be taking this seriously. So what's driving this conversation at the FCC? And this is all public information. FCC Commissioner Symington has been the one talking about this for over a year now. But it's a need for greater spectrum efficiency, and it's a view among some that receivers are the weak link in that conversation. So this NOI, adopted on a 4-0 vote last month, asks a series of questions. Everything from, turn to the next slide. How can the FCC and industry better understand the RF environment with respect to various services? How can the FCC best clarify expectations for the performance of all radio equipments? What I would say is the good news here is there are no tentative conclusions reached in this order. There are a lot of questions. But at the same time, one of the questions that is asked is around the FCC regulating receivers. And from the perspective of the consumer technology industry, and I think others in this room, the FCC getting in the business of regulating receivers would be very bad. We have seen tremendous innovation in receivers, not just GPS, but across the board over the last 2 decades. And we've talked about this over the last 2 days, the diversity of GPS receivers, high performance. We have consumer devices. The FCC doesn't have the expertise, the resources to attempt to regulate and manage that. And it would be very harmful to innovation in this space. So we're hopeful is part of this process, and I will note it has not yet been published in the Federal Register, but as part of the comment process to provide an alternative perspective about what the industry is doing to continue to evolve receiver performance from a voluntary industry-driven perspective. We don't want to see this be adversarial or combative. I think that we can work together with the FCC to offer a good story and a good narrative about what industry can do to improve receiver performance, and at the same time supporting the FCC's goal around improving spectrum efficiency. Next slide. I think that may be the last one. So those were the issues that I wanted to raise this morning. One last point on receiver performance, when I talked about how I see this as being a little different than the last few times this has come up over the past 20 years. My impression, it has traditionally been more of an academic exercise. A lot of the academics in the spectrum world have been the ones who have driven this conversation, and also engineers. And of course, those are the people who should be at the table. But what has changed now is, well, our use of spectrum has increased dramatically from 20 years ago. And then also, I'd note, Congress has taken a real notice of this. I'd point to the fact, and this has been in public press reports, Congresswoman Doris Matsui, who's on the Energy and Commerce Committee and is very likely to be either the chair or the ranking member of the Telecom Subcommittee, which has oversight of the FCC. She's planning to introduce legislation on receiver performance that, and I'm quoting from an article, that would keep the federal government from buying technology that is overly sensitive to interference from new wireless signals. And she describes her bill as being complementary to the FCC's efforts. So this has really risen to the highest levels, and I do think that this board, I'm not here to make a formal recommendation, but I hope that we can have a discussion and perhaps think about, is there a way for this advisory board to take a position on the receiver performance proceeding, and also to talk about spectral efficiency and how we fit into the larger conversation. Is if we're going to win as in terms of GPS prevailing, we need to look at ourselves as being part of the broader ecosystem of spectrum users, those in the transportation space, aviation, automotive, weather forecasting, are all seeing these similar challenges around spectral efficiency. And so I will leave my presentation at that and look forward to questions.
Thank you. That was very insightful, and I really appreciate it. One of the things that I noticed when I was initially, when we had the Light Square problem, and I went to the FCC and went in there, I think, with you, and we had a discussion. The trouble with the FCC is the second letter. It is communications, and yet the radio spectrum, there's all kinds. There's TACAN, Omnis, and then there's all the radars, and then there's GPS, and the organization seems to be unbalanced in terms of reflecting the actual using community. And they had one person, and I'm going to say this publicly, who was claimed to be a navigation expert, but none of us had ever heard of him. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's not an expert, but it certainly tends to point that way, and somehow the FCC it seems to me, has been captured by the communications side and is having great difficulty achieving the balance, in part because they don't have the technical ability to understand what navigation and timing is all about. And I say that in a pejorative way, perhaps. But nonetheless, I don't know that we're going to get them to change their name, but frankly, they are misnamed.
Jeff?
Yeah, David, I agree that was a superb presentation. Just one quick question and then some comments. The Matsui legislation, is that designed to resolve the uncertainty about the FCC's regulatory authority over receiver performance, or something else? I mean, in fairness, the FCC put the proposal out there suggesting that they might want to regulate, but they didn't claim the regulatory authority. They said it is a controverted issue, and they asked for comments on it. So they actually, it was a very fair, I thought, notice of inquiry. But I'm curious about the legislation, just as one detail.
And I will say I have not seen draft text of it, so it may be somewhat premature to speculate, but based on what I've heard, I think it may be a combination of both. I mean, addressing the authority question, and of course, if it is been accurately reported that it's specific to receivers purchased by the federal government rather than the broader, that may also be a view that that is the low-hanging fruit, or that's the easiest way to try to tackle this. And we've seen that in other spaces where the federal users are where we target first.
Good. Well, just my comment is simply that I think all of us understand that with the increasingly crowded spectrum, receiver efficiency is a critical part of the solution. We again, going back to the FAA problem, radar altimeters in airplanes were, many of them installed before there was this crowding. There was nobody adjacent to the radar altimeter band, the C band, and so there was nothing to worry about. That's no longer the case, and so clearly everybody knows they're going to have to upgrade over time those altimeters. The problem is we're living with thousands of airplanes that have legacy altimeters in them, and that's a reality. We can't stop them from flying, and we can't complicate the process of taking off to the extent that we're doing right now. So that's one. But then the longer term, at least, and you would have heard me make a presentation in our December meeting, my own conviction is that it requires an institutional solution. There has to be a change in the current burden of proof allocation in FCC proceedings, where executive branch agencies, as you say, David, who are custodians of the public interest, they have statutory responsibility for critical systems that depend on spectrum. They cannot be simply treated as supplicants before an independent regulatory agency of 5 commissioners. There has to be a different approach. They have to be co-equals, and they need to sort these things out. I happen to think the law already provides that in the case of aviation, although that was not pursued in the case that we're dealing with right now. So to the extent that we get into this, I would be more than pleased to suggest some approaches, statutory approaches, for the reauthorizations that all agencies will go through from time to time, that might very well at least raise the issue to the attention of Congress in a way that they could deal with sensibly. It is not, as you say, to blame the FCC. We live in a world of miracles for which we can thank the FCC. I mean, it's doing an incredible job, and it's a very hard job to do. And I think, Brad, to your point, I think there's a lot of expertise there. Maybe they aren't called navigation engineers, but we're talking about interference. That's a kind of generic issue. And so it's not that. I think they do have resources. The question is, what's the burden of, should the burden of proof be on the agencies that are trying to protect other systems? Why is the Secretary of Defense left writing op-ed pieces in the Wall Street Journal about a decision made by an independent regulatory agency that calls into question the integrity of GPS? That's as much evidence of failure of institutions as I've ever seen. End of screed. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral, and very good presentation, but I would like to extend my personal opinion in regard of the questionable definition of receiver. As we discussed here, and as probably some other people like Dr. Van Degelen can also justify, receiver is not more a black box in general terms. So when assessing the performance of receiver or specify the parameters or indicators of success of the receiver design, it should be noted that the receiver may be a distributed process. So although the positioning is actually spread over 3 domains, one dealing with spectrum, the other dealing with signals, the third one dealing with data, the interference can be found in all 3 domains. So the specification of the receiver or the assessment of its performance should take into account these novel developments, and just to be, on the same point to see what we are talking about. So very probably the receiver specifications will also extend some sort of expectations of the accuracy of positioning, which means that this may be a little bit even absurd or needs some redefinition in a way to get the assessment in an objective way and also comparable between the different receivers. That was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato. And thank you for that presentation. I mentioned to Brad while you were doing it, this is such a baselining way to understand everything that's useful for the entire board. I'm not sure we shouldn't start with this brief every time, saying what's happened since the last meeting, and get everybody oriented for exactly where we're at in the regulatory space when we start. So I want to thank you very much for that. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break right now, and we'll come back and start to wrap things up. No, we have to come up with a way to do that. You have to. Let's head back to our seats, folks. Folks, if we could come to our chairs, please. Okay, I think we've got most of us here. We don't have a whole lot of time left. It was an extended discussion this morning, but in my view, a discussion that was worthwhile, needed. We got a lot out of it, and I appreciate everybody's input. We're going to focus on organization and process right now as we close out the meeting. And we got a couple of gods we got to worship here, pull this whole thing together and move forward. JJ in a minute is going to talk about how we need to structure the output of the committees this year to meet some reporting requirements for GSA. Also to lay the groundwork for if and when there's an XCOM meeting in the future. Ostensibly, that's our pathway to get something approved. But we're also going to talk about other ways that we can engage at a strategic, operational, and tactical level. But moving forward, there's been a lot of stuff thrown out there, but a lot of briefings by the subcommittees. I think what we need to do is we need to distill what we've heard and have the committee, subcommittee chairs come back, reevaluate the list of topics, and not stop dealing with the topics because they're all very important. But give us, I would say, your top 2 or 3 that we need to be prepared to address going forward in terms of preparation for another meeting. Because ultimately we want to drive the content of the presentations, not only change how they're done, make them more efficient and effective, but aim the content at what the subcommittees are working on and against the overall objectives that the board is trying to reach. And to do that, and we can do some of this virtually, it doesn't have to be closed out today, but I'd like to see a couple of things. Number one are the subcommittees to come up with their, out of everything we've talked about, go back and rework it. And this is for the purpose of external reporting, not so you're going to take the eye off the ball of something you need to keep track of. But let's pick the top 3 things in each committee that we want to pursue leading up to the next meeting that we can report on the outcomes related to the GSA reporting requirement. I'll let JJ talk about that in a minute. And then what I'd like to do is, and we're going to have to figure out how to do this, so I think we're probably okay on the FACA side. I'd like to come out of this with just an overarching statement of principles so we can set the precedent of having come up with a sense of the board, state it, where it doesn't have to be routed through somebody, go through a steering group, and then get to the XCOM that's never met with the deputies in my time on the board. and actually put out in public domain transparently the sense of the board. The overwhelming sense of the board, as I see it right now, is our basic doctrine, and everybody's reaffirmed this and nobody's disagreed with it. Our overall doctrine approach to how we're going to manage our responsibilities as a space-based PNT advisory board is through the doctrine of protect, toughen, and augment. And then everything will derive from that, and we can start coming up with what I would call a strategic umbrella that'll allow us to start focusing in on the portions of the subcommittee that are operating, not only the PTA, but everybody else. So what I'd like to do, and I don't know how this is going to, we need to work this, JJ. I'd like to take a crack at a one-page doctrinal statement of doctrine for PTA, maybe a couple of bullets under each of them saying, moving forward, this is the position of the board about how we view our world of work and the doctrinal principles by which we're going to operate under as we move forward, and get that out there unrebutted as a statement of principle from the board, so we set up the precedent of putting work products out there that are the result of the board deliberations that do not require anybody's approval, but a statement of the board. So that's kind of where my head's at. So let me stop there and let JJ talk about how we need to structure what it is we're going to do to meet our reporting requirements for GSA.
All right, thank you, sir. So in preparation for this meeting, the last few days, we sent out templates, and there was some explanation to that, but I think it's just a little bit easier if I speak to it quickly. The templates really reflect how we're graded by the federal government. It's our report every year to the General Services Administration. How much money did we spend on the advisory board? What were the results? What were the recommendations? And what was the government's response to the recommendations? And then there's a series of metrics in terms of money saved, public safety improvements, and so forth. And so what we really need to do now, since we've been distracted by some more urgent issues such as the legato spectrum issue, is really take a look, as the Admiral has said, on our strategic efforts and where do we want to go in the future with the new subcommittees. And so we do need to fill out these templates in the form of a recommendation. There will be several, I expect, and these have to be really completed by the end of the fiscal year. So in America, that is September 30th. So my thought process was, we've had a great discussion. We did not have a chance to go over the recommendation templates in detail. So one suggestion is that we host a virtual meeting between now and September 30th. That will give the subcommittees time to continue working on their issues. We can host fact-finding meetings in the interim, but let's say sometime in September we do have a full virtual meeting, maybe it's half a day, to have the subcommittee chairs present their proposed recommendations. The board goes around, yay or nay, and those that are adopted would become our input into the PNT Executive Committee. And so, of course, Stormy will be working on trying to get the deputy secretaries to attend that. And the way the process is supposed to work is Admiral Allen submits the recommendations to the group. He could do it verbally and he can do it with a memo. And then the co-chairs of the PNT Executive Committee should in fact respond to that. So we could actually see what are they interested in, what are they going to support, what are they not so interested in. And I worked a similar process working for Dr. Pace with the National Space Council User Advisory Group. Admiral Jim Ellis would send in a memo. Dr. Pace would work with the Vice President. And then, of course, we would get a response back and know what they felt were the priorities that we should focus on. So I think that's a very clear-cut process. And let me just stop there and see if there are any questions to that.
Hey, let me just combine what I said with what JJ told you. We have a world of work, and it's very robust, and it's broad, and it's expansive. What we need to do is pull out the precious few that we would like to make sure get to the XCOM, and then we would like an up or down feedback on whether they're doing it or not, and we need to start documenting this for perpetuity moving forward, curate and archive it. That doesn't mean you stop doing the work of the subcommittee, but we need you to pull out those couple that are really meaningful where we want an up or down answer from the XCOM and get ready to move those forward. Do it at the virtual meeting so we're prepared to affirm that, and I can send it on at the XCOM towards the end of the year. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions. I realize it's a little ambiguous, but we're forming up and doing this. We've never done it before. Jeff?
Point of clarification. The board will remember that in February, the first product of the Strategy, Policy, and Governance Subcommittee was some recommendations on internal governance. We recommended that we have a single theme for each meeting, that we have briefings that only were relevant to that theme, and so forth and so on. I haven't had any feedback. Should we produce a template, a form on that?
No, that refers to my original comments about trying to run the next meeting differently. Just if you could, we'll dig them out, because what you said is just what I said. We need to be focused. We need to be about themes at our future meetings.
Yeah.
That's a procedural thing we just need to incorporate, in my view.
Okay, but are we going to engage on that, or is that accepted? Or I mean, we've never had any response, and we certainly didn't follow any of those rules on this meeting. So I'm just
I'm happy to have a discussion right now. We're limited on time, but I kind of laid out where I think we ought to go for the next meeting. I'm happy to hear any discussion or dissenters or affirmative or where we need to go on this, but as far as I'm concerned, and we can work this virtually offline.
Okay, so that's not part of the output that JJ.
No. I'm sorry, Jeff. That's internal governance as I see it. Is that what you mean? Yeah. Thanks.
So the set of recommendations we forwarded in 2018, is that going to be part of this, or are we just going to do going forward?
I think since we're reconstituting, we have the subcommittees, let's zero base it and move forward. Let's not trying to keep track of all the agency recommendations of what our work list should be through the NCO. In my view, that was an exercise in futility. That got us nowhere. All we got was nobody could agree, so everybody's recommendation. We ended up with, 18 items that they want us to pursue, half of which we didn't have the resources nor the span of control to be able to address. Dana? Del?
Yes, sir. Thanks. In terms of the recommendations, to me, if our intent is to make these recommendations actionable so that they're actually implemented in either policy or in budgets or in budget guidance or in strategic planning documentation, or if it's the president, I mean, the president still signs out executive orders to the departments to go do work. I just want to make sure that by September, do you think we're going to have actionable recommendations? The reason I'm asking is that I really looked at the PTA brief from yesterday, and it's good work, but I think the recommendations are right at this level of maturity. Those recommendations were to pursue additional studies, additional analysis. But to me, if we're going to make actionable recommendations to the deputies, I mean, they've got to have the results of these efforts in terms of what's the scope, what's the implication, there's some level of specificity to make a recommendation actionable at that level. So I just want to make sure what is the element in September that we're going to provide.
Sorry. I would say the subcommittee work in bringing this forward, make it an actionable item. If you're having trouble figuring out whether it's actionable or not, I'm happy to have a discussion about it and move it forward. We just need to have them be able to respond to it. And frankly, some of this is still formative because we're doing this for the first time, by the way. I realize it's your first meeting, but we haven't organized or done anything like this before. But in this case, having an actionable item of having a long-term plan on how we're going to look at particular technology and how we're going to advise on it, like high accuracy services, and saying by this date we will produce recommendations on it, that's an action item that starts to get us there. We may have to do that to begin with.
Got it.
If I could add, I really agree with what you said, and I think we almost need a very brief little checklist of what an action item is in our context, which includes, is it actionable, and I suspect there are a number of other facets, but a very simple say, if it doesn't pass these gates, it's not an action item we're going to entertain.
Right. So for me, like, when we provide, in our acquisition business in the Space Force, when we provide actual recommendations up to our 4-star, we actually have to provide, if it's guidance, we provide the language. Here's the recommended language going into guidance. If it's funding, we say, here's the recommended funding profile that goes into the budget. To me, I know that's a lot of specifics, but if they're going to be actionable, some attempt must be made as to what it is the senior is going to approve for action. And at that level, it's either language for planning, language for policy, or it's funding for our budget. And then if we catch it in September, in the Space Force, that's when we start doing the kickoff of the fiscal year planning. For us, that'll be FY25. So, because this summer, we deliver our FY24 budget, and then immediately after we deliver it, we're into FY25 planning. And that's going to be the first time, if there's something budget-related, that we can catch a budget cycle. So I think one element of making it actionable, at least dealing with the federal government, is identifying which fiscal year we're talking about here. And so if our goal is to say we're going to have actual recommendations and we're going to drive decisions for FY25, policy, planning, programming, and budget, September's our cutoff. That's our goal. Over.
I understand that. Let me just make it quick difference. We don't report to a 4-star. Okay. We report to an amorphous XCOM.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a different. I'm the former 8 in the Coast Guard, so I got you there. I got you there. But the questions that we've got here, are, in my view, and I'm happy to hear what anybody wants. Let's take high accuracy services. We've been all around that issue. We heard from the folks at Oak Ridge, the global DGPS and so forth. The central question there is, what is the government's position on high accuracy services? What's the demand? Who provides it? How we set up the business model? Because right now, there's a lot of different tentacles of that going all different directions. Understanding how that is going to work across government and have a unified position on how we manage that between the Department of Energy at Oak Ridge and the JPL at Caltech, I think becomes operative, because then you're able to figure out who wants it, who's going to do it, how we're going to pay for it, and who's accountable to produce it. So in my view, that's rather than saying here's a budget line item for 24, I'd rather have some clarity about what do we think about high accuracy services. But I'd be curious what everybody thinks.
Okay. Del, I want to say I totally appreciate your point. And, just as a couple of examples, retroreflectors should be put on GPS. Space service volume should be part of GPS. These are specific recommendations that were made and were adopted, right? There are a little bit more complicated ones. There should be a backup for GPS. Enhanced Loran was pushed several times to all the deputy secretaries. Everyone agreed to it, not only the advisory board, but the actual DepSecs, but no one agency wanted to come forward and put forward the money. So a budget, right. And of course, spectrum, right? We don't believe that interference should be allowed in the adjacent band. We've been very clear about that. So we've made many, many recommendations, some more complex than others, some very simple. But it is up to the government to respond. And I think what the Admiral has stated is, unfortunately, we haven't had a very consistent level of leadership that has been there to respond. And so in many cases, we're providing information out there, but we're not sure exactly what's being acted upon.
I don't believe in my entire tenure on this board I've seen a XCOM that was actually attended by the deputies, which is what's called for in the directive.
And that was not in the early days.
It's a multi-headed thing we're dealing with here. We're trying to adapt as we move forward. Mike?
So if I might just maybe add to what Del was saying here, for those that have not lived through budgetary hell within the federal bureaucracy and the rest of that, I think the point here is the fall is the time of the year where all of these decisions finally come to a head, because they have to be in the president's budget and when it's delivered in the February, March time period. So anything that we make any progress on or hope to achieve or whatever else, that's the place and the time where you got to get your voice heard or to be working it overall. So again, I think that that's not our job to be making the budgetary decisions or to lobbying or whatever else, but that's just where it's going to come to a head. And the degree to which we're aware of that and can help that, I think, would help improve our effectiveness.
No, I think you're absolutely right in the long run. I think we're not to the specificity of a line item budget recommendation for 24 in this case. What we'd like to do is just get the policy issue on the table so that next year if we had it, at least they'd know what we were talking about. In my view, it'd be a major victory just to get the deputies to the meeting.
It might not be relevant, but we are in a little bit of a different budget situation because of the Multi-Year Infrastructure Investment Act. So if there are infrastructure things that could conceivably be funded by that, we're kind of in an ongoing rolling process for that. So,
yeah, I didn't want to muddy the waters. I reached out to Mitch Landrieu, who's the chair of the White House Office on Infrastructure Investment. He's a former mayor of New Orleans. I worked with him during the oil spill and the hurricane. I'm going to meet with him and his staff on Monday. I wasn't going to burden the board with that. That's the strategy stuff. Matt?
Yeah, I'm concerned about how actionable our actionables need to be because, I mean, let's take an example. On that table I presented, we had should future GPS have inter-satellite links, okay? We would do a little bit of investigation that we could in the subcommittee, but there is no way we can go and say, here's a costed proposal to the Defence Department to put in the satellite links on GPS 4. That work has to be done in the government. So, I mean, I can't see how we can report at a level of costing, etc., that's in this report template that. So, for example, it was should retroreflectors should be on GPS. It wasn't here's a plan of how to put retroreflectors on GPS. So I'm just trying to understand what's really expected of level of detail.
Yeah, let me.
And there's only so much I can do as an Australian citizen.
I'm the chair. I own it. Okay. If you can price it, price it. If you can't price it, talk about it. Okay. What you guys are dealing with is creating a framework by which to ask hard questions that drive us to a point where we need to understand what kind of PNT architecture should be built in this country. You can call it the gold standard or whatever you want, but the first step you took, the deliverable I would see from you all is, you can still call it draft, a draft framework for considering the relationship of government GPS and the GNSS framework around the world, about how we might want to move forward and what standard we should seek for resilient assured PNT, and this is the way we want to frame the conversation for the PNT Advisory Board. You don't have to cost that.
What I'm struggling with is we're an advisory board, not an action board.
Yeah.
I just want to.
What's actionable is somebody to accept that as the framework we're going to use. So what you say is, here's the framework. You send it up to the XCOM. If they don't respond, that's the answer.
It's a kind of a meta problem.
Yeah. Where we can, we will do it. And JJ's involved every day in the program management at NASA and knows where those intervention points are where we can make a difference. In the meantime, we need to evolve what it is we're going to be about, and that's the fact that nobody's got their arms around an overarching interagency cross-government framework for how we view resilient PNT, who owns it, and how we think about it, and how we create policy. You know, we got to get an umbrella over this before we can parse it down. In the meantime, we're working from the bottom up with the work extent that the subcommittees have identified based on the information we're receiving and the networks we've established in the advisory board.
Just to make my point stark, I cannot tell you what the outcome for improvement for health and safety is from inter-satellite links. Right? And
I'm about ready to withdraw all of those. I'm about ready to withdraw all the templates. I'll talk to JJ about it.
I just quickly want to respond. It's a good point, Matt, that you bring up, but the quick example, what are the benefits of retroreflectors, right? We're not going to get into that, but we all understand what that is. That had to be articulated to the executive committee. Now, what that did was that created budget, because there were multiple agencies that wanted to do it, and now they're going on, and Mr. De La Peña is actually helping us to get them on earlier. So SV 9 and 10 versus 11, right? So people have come to understand that. The discussion started here.
But it's kind of at the level of, based on the amount of work that we were able to do, here's some evidence that we think retroreflectors are a good idea. And then you took that to government.
The point is, you have to have a starting.
Yeah.
You have to have a start.
Yeah.
And GDGPS, that's the most recent. Guess what has happened already? I don't know that it's been announced. My colleague in the Science Mission Directorate, Ben Phillips, has been able to build a budget wedge for NASA to actually have money at JPL for operations. That money did not exist before. It was reimbursable funding brought in from the private sector. And so the discussion here prompted NASA to do another independent assessment, which Larry James was aware of. So two assessments coming to the same conclusion. This is of national benefit, and we need to do what we need to ensure its stability. So this board does have a big impact.
I would say this, okay? Let us translate it. If you get us the material that we need, we'll put it in the format and make it user-friendly. Okay, we shouldn't push down to you a regulatory responsibility the government has levied on us. That's our staff's responsibility. You get us the right information, we'll put it in the format. Is that all right, JJ? Yes, sir. Okay, Penny, I think you had a question or comment?
I had a comment. I guess I was thinking we should try to take care of the low-hanging fruit. So to me, the Haas capability, the high accuracy capability that Frank put forward is something we should go forward with. It's been shown to be technically possible with available systems already in place to create the information. There are means of distribution that exist, and it has clear benefit and precedent with other, international GNSS. So I feel like we should proceed with that as a recommendation that I think would be easy to fill in the table for, and I think there's considerable benefit for it. I also think that on the PTA subcommittee recommendations, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. On the PTA subcommittee recommendations, I thought that the export barrier one was a similarly, motherhood and apple pie thing that we really should address. It's a problem for our industry. We should take care of it. It will have tremendous benefit. And then I have others that kind of go down the list. But to me, those two are the ones that I think are quite actionable and impactful. I think we should go with them. We should do those.
Thanks, Penny. I'm totally agreeing with you personally, because I keep using high accuracy services because I'm one of these people you have to talk to. I'm the budget guy. I'm the commandant of the Coast Guard. You got to come in and make a case to me. And when I think about what's going on and how I would respond to all of this, the issues you've raised are the ones I would say, that sounds to me like a no-brainer, especially when we were able to get a budget wedge into NASA for global DGPS.
So if we do those, we've sort of established the pathway for making other, maybe more complex recommendations in the future, but I feel like we should proceed.
I agree, Penny. Thank you. Okay, where are we, JJ? We got what we need here? Sorry, go ahead.
That's really not a question. I'd like to bring up maybe one more potential recommendation, and it's related to what we've been doing on the Education and Science Committee. We try to understand really how we can phrase any recommendations, and I think we concluded that our job is really to illuminate the problem, because the problem is known. We have a number of documents which were produced by National Science Board, by National Academy of Engineering, and by PCAST, by OSTP. So it appears to me that some of the geospatial intelligence, I would say geospatial agencies understand the problem. They talk about the problem, but they seem to kind of fail into bringing this up to decision-making level. And I just wonder if the recommendation from this committee could actually help this process, because I can tell you how it worked in the past. I am a hardcore geodesist trained at Ohio State. At that time, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and National Geodetic Survey had students every year, about a dozen from every, because this is how they actually met their needs for staffing. In around late 90s, it started dwindling down and it's completely stopped. So if the government doesn't show the university that the program is needed by bringing research money, by sending students, then it's not going to be built back. Even though there is something close to the crisis, it's not only geodesy, but I think geodesy is probably the most pronounced. But also, we don't need industrial production of geodesists. So what I'm trying to say is one of the recommendations we could take upon us is also to maybe recommend that those geospatial agencies maybe come together, provide us information really what is needed, but at the same time they need to be persuasive enough to get the budget for research and for education. Because we produce international PhDs, and government is not going to hire them. So to me at the moment, and I think Terry Moore just very nicely showed up also how UK is doing this. At the moment, it's probably the only and the fastest solution is government reinvest in their own staff. I don't know, Jade, if you have anything to add.
One way to do that would be to take the recommendation forward to do just what you said to the XCOM with the recommendation that they forward it with their approval to Office of Science Technology Policy in the White House. And they would have the reach to take a look at how they might want to address this across the interagency. So again, I think if you give us the case, I think we can tell you how to structure it so we can put it into the template. Okay, I think we're approaching time. JJ, we want to go over the next meeting and logistics associated with that.
Yes, thank you. So just in terms of the next meeting, face-to-face meeting, what we would propose is the week prior to Thanksgiving. I don't have my calendar right in front of me. Perhaps it's November 14th.
It's 15th through the 17th.
Okay, thank you, sir. Redondo Beach, I think a number of us have been there several times. Leisha would be on the hunt, but first thing is we want to make sure that our leadership's available and then most of the membership. Of course, we'll continue to have virtual meetings because everyone's, not going to be able to make every meeting, but we will do our best to accommodate. So just a feel around the room, does that sound like a doable option?
Why don't you ask how many can't?
Okay.
I know Russ has a conflict.
Yeah, that's the week of the meeting of the UN World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations. And certainly it would be nice if it could be early in December, but if it's that week, could you consider at least making it Wednesday through Friday instead of Tuesday through Thursday to allow me a little flexibility in doing some travel and virtual participation?
Yeah, so we throw out that date, that week, because really after that it gets into the holiday season, right? So these venues get booked up quickly. In terms of the days of the week, we tried to prevent people from having to fly on the weekends and actually just do our work in the core middle of the week. But I think Russ, of course, will look at that. But we want to help the majority of the people. We want your participation, so let us look at that.
Yeah, the last Redondo Beach meeting was actually in December.
We know, that's why we're looking at November.
We'll do our best, Russ, no promises.
Leisha has a point there as our logistics lead. Yeah, Dr. Parkinson reminds us that's the election week.
And also Veterans Day.
Veterans Day.
I don't know if that is a big problem, but
Well, I just put that out there. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it because we'll send out a.
wait, just for closure.
Yep, yep.
The only one we have heard from that has a problem is Russ. Is that right?
So far.
So, and we're going to work and see if there's some adjustment that can be made.
Yes, sir.
But if we can't, we'll go with those dates. Okay? JJ, anything else?
Okay, so that is our face-to-face. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, in my opinion, and I'm sure the Admiral shares this, we really do want to be productive in between meetings. So the subcommittees will be able to continue to meet in a fact-finding preparatory manner. We're going to work to have a designated federal officer always with you because that's a requirement of holding those meetings. And then again, I would suggest that we set up a virtual meeting so that you have the opportunity to actually put forward recommendations, and then the Admiral is well armed when he goes into the next Deputy Secretary meeting, which hopefully is prior to our November face-to-face. So is there any opposition or concern about that path forward? And we'll provide more details via email as we progress.
And I would say just finally, so we start to build this, what I would call a strategic architecture, I'm going to take a stab at about a 2-page paper that's high-level principles which we're going to operate under that embodies PTA. And then we can start using that to kind of do, for the engineers, it'd be a work breakdown structure, but kind of start adding everything to it. Ultimately, we can include all the subcommittee work there. But I'll do that and get it out. I don't know how we have to, well, I'll get it out. Probably the next week or so for everybody to take a look at. If there's not anything else for the good of the order, JJ, get my AJs and JJs mixed up. Anything else we need to do other than let these people hit the road or have lunch?
That's all I have, sir. Any other last comments, questions, concerns, criticisms? Save those for later.
Well, I thank everybody for your patience. We're actually forming and storming here a little bit. This board's been reconstituted to do something radically different than we have in the past, and we're kind of feeling our way, and we're in an amorphous situation related to the governance structure has been well laid out there. So I just appreciate your continued patience as we move forward on this. I've found this extremely informative, a lot of exchange of information, and I think as a group we're getting a lot smarter and have a lot more insight on what's going on against our problem set. So thank you all.